Your Excellency, Rector, I'm really pleased and delighted to be here. It's my first time in Ukraine, of course in Lviv, this beautiful city and this wonderful university, so I'm honored to be here. I wanted to talk in some ways about what I see as some of the origins of populism and nationalism and some of the what I think might be the Catholic alternative. But in order to do that, what I want to focus on is what seems to me is strikingly similar across what we think of as the opposites today of socialism, a system of government that obviously Ukraine is all too familiar with, as well as liberalism, a system of government that it's becoming more familiar with, and certainly in the United States we're quite familiar with. And it seems to me that for all of the many differences of these political philosophies and practices, there are I would suggest two main features that they share in common, and that we're certainly seeing in advanced liberalism as much as I think was experienced in under communism. The first of these is what I would describe as the depoliticization of the political. The effort in some ways to remove from the realm that is rightly understood as being political, you could say the political aspects or practices. I think things that Clemens was suggesting as well, the decline of the role of the citizen, the rise, for example, in the United States, a long history, for example, of the rise of the executive over the legislative, the rise of the role of the executive branch as increasingly the sole most important feature. If you've been to Washington, D.C., you may have noticed that geographically the Capitol is on the hill. It's called the hill tower, the Capitol Hill. And the intention of the Founding Fathers was that the legislative branch should be the most important of the branches. And yet, when we talk about the government of the United States, how often do we talk about Congress versus whoever occupies the White House? So the displacement of the popular branch for what is supposed to have been the branch that merely executes the popular will, and its replacement in many ways. But of course, those who study the presidency would be the first to acknowledge that the president, him or herself perhaps someday, is actually relatively weak in relationship to a permanent bureaucracy. That no matter who holds the presidency, and someone who comes in for 4 years or for 8 years, it almost doesn't matter because there's a permanent bureaucracy that's always there and that effectively runs the executive branch. And so that you have the rise, for example, of the role of experts and the reliance upon social sciences as the primary way in which one understands political matters. Of course, social science, the intention behind social science, speaking as something of a social scientist, was to displace the role of values in politics, or even the idea that politics is a realm of contestation, and that rather, in fact, through social sciences, one could resolve all political questions as basically questions of expertise or technique. John F. Kennedy had a famous line in which he said, effectively, that all what we had thought of as political questions could now be replaced effectively by the rule of experts that could simply answer the kinds of questions that once seemed to be political. In more recent years, not only do we have, of course, the bureaucracy, but I think a particular kind of bureaucracy occupied by a particular kind of human type. I think this type was described extremely well in a book that goes all the way back to the 1950s by James Burnham called The Managerial Elite. And if you're not familiar with the book, it's a book that seems to be remarkably prescient and prophetic. Burnham, in writing of the rise of what he called this managerial elite, described this managerial elite as a new kind of ruling class. It was going to displace an old ruling class which had been in some ways defined by the ownership of property. You think about the old aristocracy, or even a kind of relatively newer aristocracy, the people who control the means of production, to use the Marxist term. And what was striking about the managerial elite is that the managerial elite doesn't necessarily control property in that same way. They don't control businesses necessarily, or if they do, it's really as managers and not as people who sort of make the stuff. But managers are, in a way, the managerial elite occupies both the public and the private realm. They occupy the government as well as the corporate world, and they displace the old role of property owners. And what's striking, Burnham's description of this, is that the old aristocracy, the old property owners, had in a sense natural limits, geographic limits. Property was actual physical stuff. And it also was protected by a whole series of, and indeed a kind of development of the idea of rights and duties, privileges and duties that attached to those forms of property. And thus that property ownership was defined, protected, but also constrained by political rights, and therefore necessitated an understanding of a political role for this ruling elite. But that the rise of this managerial elite, in fact, disassociated the ruling class from any particular set or understanding of property, and thus that there was no limit to the power of the managers of this managerial elite. And in fact, managers, this managerial elite, would have every incentive to increase their own power through the expansion of larger and larger domains in the name of neutral competence and also in the name of certain laws of inevitability. And we hear these all the time now: the inevitability of globalization, the inevitability of automation, the inevitability of certain kinds of economic forces, the flattening of the globe, and so forth. That the managers claim the mantle of neutrality and being disinterested in certain kinds of outcomes, merely sort of bringing into being certain kinds of laws and forces. And one sees this both in the managerial elite within the government as well as in the corporate world. That is to say, you move to both a kind of transnational and non-political set of claims and engagements. The ruling elite then seeks to expand the extent of managerial and political, you could say, institutions, their role in these various institutions, and think of both governments or even trans-governmental institutions as well as corporations today. That these are now seen as really existing beyond any kind of national boundary or national border, and that what's striking is these are often at the expense of nation states in order to enhance the power of the managerial elite to organize the world economy and increasingly world state. Thus, Burnham observed that managerialism combines an ongoing growth of the state apparatus based upon the rule of expertise and technique at the expense of the weakening of national sovereignty. And these two things could be happening at the same time, sort of increase of statism with a decrease of, you could say, of the political. The ability of the state in some ways to be the area of contestation of politics. To quote Burnham, quote, "The comparatively large number of sovereign nations under managerial capitalism is being replaced by a comparatively small number of great nations or superstates which will divide the world between them." This is before the beginnings of the EU and so forth. Some of the many nations which are eliminated, in fact, may be preserved in form. They won't go away, but their function will effectively be stripped. They may be kept as administrative subdivisions, but they will be stripped of sovereignty. That doesn't, in some ways, presage certain kinds of contemporary aspects, it seems to me, of the world. Very few descriptions do. Thus, you could say politics and the role of politics, again, as the realm of contestation of citizens and civic concerns, is replaced by technique and expertise. Political institutions, think of the legislature, is replaced increasingly by bureaucracy, by commissions, by NGOs, by quasi-public private institutions, the Federal Reserve being a good example of one of these. Is it public? Is it private? What is it exactly? The managerial elite, in a way, detaches itself from any particular polity, understanding itself to be a class, and indeed a transnational class, and indeed institutions where the likes of many of us teach, certainly where I teach, understands that we are training this class, and our students understand that they are being trained to be a part of this class. This is maybe as part of this toxic elite. And as a result, they are increasingly, you could say, disconnected from any idea of the demos. And in their more, let's say, unconstrained and private moments are actually disdainful of the demos. What's striking about the managerial elite is that they claim the language of democracy, being the representatives of democracy, but democracy as a set of given conclusions that they themselves have arrived at that do not require popular consent. And one of the sources, it seems to me, of the rise of populism is precisely the growing sense among the demos that their views, indeed that the political is no longer represented. So that's the first aspect that I want to speak of as kind of in some ways, a kind of deeper continuity between, you could say, the ideologies of communism and the ideologies of liberalism. But the second is, oddly enough, the politicization of in some ways I would say the social. The politicization of that which should not be politicized in this sense. It was Thomas Aquinas who amended Aristotle. Aristotle said that men are by nature political animals. And Aquinas amended that by saying man is by nature a social and political animal. And that one word, it seems to me, is extremely important. That the social defines a realm that exists not entirely separate from, but is distinct from the political. This, of course, was an emendation that departs from Aristotle and departs from the classical teaching that understands that the individual is subsumed in the political order, that there is no order in some ways apart from the political order. As Aquinas seemed to articulate, governments exist for men, not men for governments. That the individual and the dignity of the individual and the dignity of the social realm is not defined entirely by the political. While the state in this understanding is the highest and in some ways the most perfected or teleologically perfected form of human organization, nevertheless it exists for further ends, to secure the ends of individuals, particularly ends that exist beyond politics. This is an understanding not necessarily available to Aristotle, but certainly a Christian understanding, that the finis ultimus, the greatest good, is the good beyond this mortal life, the good beyond any earthly city, consisting of the internal enjoyment and felicity of the presence of God. Thus the social is the realm in which, you could say, is preserved from the encroachment of the political. So you have the trans-political or the supra-political in the form of religion, but you also have the sub-political, which is in some ways where, in many ways, one's understanding of one's religion and one's deepest form of education and socialization occurs, which is in the family. This is also understood to be, in some ways, beyond the political. As Pope Leo XIII articulated in the first of the great social encyclicals, De Rerum Novarum, he regarded the family as the God-ordained cell of society, and argued that no human action or law can, and I quote, abolish the natural and original right of marriage, nor in any way limit the chief and principal purpose of marriage ordained by God's authority from the beginning, increase and multiply. Leo continued, hence we have the family, the society of a man's house, a society very small, one must admit, but nonetheless a true society, and one older than any state, unquote. From this, then, he argued the natural family gains duties and rights peculiar to itself and quite independent of the state. So articulating that there's a realm beyond, in some ways, the state and politics. But if we think today, where is the sort of the greatest politicization, some of our greatest political contestations today, it takes place precisely at this intersection of the family and religion, and indeed how these two, you could say, combine. In the first instance, both in some ways need to be defined and in some senses controlled by the state, understood to exist at the forbearance of the state and defined by the state. And they become the main object of political controversy, indeed increasingly linked by debates over the redefinition of the family that bring into question the role and space of religion and religious liberty. Thus you could say that the modern state, in its various forms, whether liberal, whether communist, but in some senses deeply ideological, seeks on the one hand to depoliticize the political and to politicize that which should exist in some ways beyond the political, the social realm, particularly that intersection of the family and religion. So very quickly then, what is the Catholic alternative, if there is one? And it seems to me that what we see in this, the definition of this conference, the rise of nationalism and populism, is in some ways the effort to repoliticize the political, or to assert the importance of a realm of the political, which consists of a criticism of the elites, right, the toxic elites, the pushback against bureaucrats, undemocratic and ungovernable bureaucrats, the critique of a kind of anti-democratic spirit that exists at the level of sort of the bureaucracy or the managerial elite. And the common objects are things like the European Union, the United Nations, the World Bank, the bureaucracy, the swamp of Washington, D.C., that pure permanent bureaucracy. And populism, such as it's called, and this is often a term used by the elites to define what it is that exactly they don't like, is in some ways, you could say, the reaction of the demos to the depoliticization of society. However, what seems to me to be lacking, deeply lacking in this, what I think is, in many ways, an admirable reaction, does not speak to the core commitments of what, in some ways, the political exists for, which is that which lies beyond politics. It seeks to repoliticize the world, but not for the sake of that which lies beyond politics. It doesn't speak of the social in some ways. In fact, it seems to me strikingly like a kind of repaganization of politics, the diminution of what we might think of as that which is beyond politics for the sake of the political. So you see the rise of nationalism occurring often in places that simultaneously are seeing the decline of the family and the decline of practice of religion. So on the one hand, I suggest that nationalism and populism, and this is very, very cursory treatment, arise from a kind of healthy reaction against the depoliticization of the political. But without a leavening, it seems to me, of Catholic Christianity, there's a kind of danger of it itself becoming a new form of a kind of comprehensive politicization, a kind of repaganization of politics. So while it simply can't be the case that the stance of rejection of this reaction is salutary, it does seem to me that there's a special obligation and perhaps an opportunity of Catholic Christianity to tutor, to direct, and to seek to propagate an understanding that the true end of politics lies beyond politics, and a necessary but not sufficient condition begins with the politicization of what has been depoliticized, but also the depoliticization of, unfortunately, what has been overly politicized in our age. Thank you.